God's make some promises to Abraham. Part of that is entering the promised land, and there'll be a nation, many descendants, and there'll be a blessing to other nations. Abraham kind of has descendants, and it all starts to happen. Long story short, Israel find themselves in Egypt, and for 400 years, and they're slaves. But then God speaks to another guy, this is hundreds of years later, Moses, who takes them out of Egypt, brings them, and the idea was he was going to bring them into the promised land, but there was a bit of, again, long story there. They sinned, it didn't happen for a long time. In fact, Moses sinned and couldn't enter the promised land. And then Joshua takes Israel, God's people now, into the promised land, and he was to kind of dominate the area, and but didn't do it. And then, so there was no peace in the land for Israel. And then judges kind of came in, and people kind of were ruled by judges. And then this guy Samuel raised up, and this is where we took on 1 Samuel. Samuel comes, and God kind of uses Samuel. He's kind of a priest, and he works in the temple. And at that time, God's people asked for a king like all the other nations, and that was and that was a bad thing, because God was their king. God always had in mind that Israel would have a king, but it was a king of his choosing, but they wanted a king like all the other nations. Anyway, this big, tall bloke, Saul, kind of handsome guy, he gets chosen as king, and he sins, he doesn't listen to God. And kind of, we're in a period where we've looked at Saul's rise to kind of prominence and his rule, but his failure as well, and we start to see Saul's failure. But we're in the part of 1 Samuel where we heard last time, we were looking through 1 Samuel, God's choosing another king, and we kind of got this strange little story of Samuel visiting this kind of backward kind of place where this guy called Jesse was there, and he had, I forget how many sons he had. I know I'll mention it later on. I've forgotten in the front of I think 8 sons, and David was there, and he went through all the sons thinking the oldest son would be the son that he chooses, but it wasn't. It was the youngest son, David, and no one thought of David. He was actually out kind of looking after sheep when Samuel came, and so they called him in, and he was anointed. But then the story goes on, and we hear things about Saul and stuff like that, but we've got this kind of backstory, 2 stories going at once: the downfall of Saul and just the beginnings of this other story of David. And we come across this famous passage in 1 Samuel of David and Goliath. I'm going to continue to do this 1 Samuel in the style we've been doing it, where I'll just read it because it's a story, and you don't want to wreck a story by telling the story before you tell the story. And so I'll read it and make comments on the way through. The passage will come up, but if you have Bibles, that would be handy as well, and you can see it. It's 1 Samuel 17. And the story begins something like this. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-dammim, between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. Here is the valley of Elah. That looks kind of nice valley. But it wasn't in the day. There was actually a war going on. That looks peaceful, like you want to go and visit that. But in the day, there was a battle. Philistines on one hill and Israel on another, and tensions were high. This was more than a battle, though, over land. This was about the credibility of Israel's God. It was something, the battle spoke something about who he was. And that's because of the culture of the day. It's really amazing, wonderful. God is not just doesn't speak so we don't understand. He speaks into cultures. He speaks into our culture. He speaks into the culture of the day. The culture of the day was, and it's just how people thought. It wasn't. They didn't think about thinking. They just thought this, that if you were a nation and you went to battle another nation, whoever won, it showed that their God was bigger than the other God, more powerful than the other God. That's just how people thought. And so God used this, and with Israel, as he went to battle, he showed that he was the God of heaven and earth. But also, as we remember back in reading through 1 Samuel previously, we also know God will not just kind of be used as a tool by Israel in battle. So when Israel messed up, when Israel sinned against God, when Israel took God with contempt, he would use other nations to attack Israel. And so it wasn't Israel was the thing and God was their God to help them in battle. No, God was a holy God, an awesome God, and he chose Israel to show who he was. And as he did that, he would be a blessing they would be a blessing to other nations, because other nations would go, wow, Israel's God is the God of heaven and earth, want a bit of that, and they'll worship the true God of heaven and earth. Also, the land they were fighting for goes back to the promises of Abraham. This was the promised land that they hoped to achieve. So there's a bit of significance about what was going on. It wasn't just a battle. There was something about God in this battle. We read in verse 4, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. The word champion actually literally means the man of the between. It was a way of describing anyone who comes out forward from the front line. He was between the two nations then, like he would step forward. He was between. He was a challenger, a champion. And what a challenger he was. We read about him. His height was about 6 cubits and a span. That would have impressed you, wouldn't it? That's 9'9", or 297 centimetres. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armour of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. That's about 57 kilos. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Basically, if you didn't pick up all that, what it's saying is this guy was a tank, and he had the latest weaponry, the superior technology for battle. We're meant to get the idea that this Philistine's armour was impenetrable, and his weapons were fierce, and how would anyone go up against him? That's the question. Verse 8, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul?" The question calls the Israelites to start questioning themselves. You go, well, what's so wrong about that question? He's saying, why are you opposing the Philistines? Who are the Philistines? Well, the Philistines are personified in me, this great hulk of a man who stands before them. The emphasis as he describes this is on this personal pronoun. He's kind of saying, I am Philistia, big, strong, powerful, full of weapons, strong, like I could wipe out, I am it. And who are you? You are slaves of Saul. By the way, as we kind of think through this, you've got to ask your question is, where is Saul? Here's the battle of God's people, Israel, against their enemy, the Philistines, and yet where is Saul in this story? What he's saying is, what Goliath is saying is, take another look. Do Saul's slaves really want to fight the Philistines? Look how big I am. Then comes his proposal. It's kind of like a proposal, kind of, look, this is going to save a lot of time. Choose a man. Don't let's not fight nations. That's too many people get sweaty and hot and, get hungry. It's just one-on-one. Choose a man. and have him come down to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we'll become your subjects. And if I overcome him and kill him, you'll become our subjects and serve us." Now, who would the Israelites choose to represent them against what looked like such an imposing force? Again, your mind goes back as you read this story, and you might remember they already chose an impressive man. Remember him? He was taller than everyone else. He was impressive. He was a king like the other nations. He was someone who they thought would lead them out into battle. When this king was chosen, they thought that he would end their troubles with their enemies. Do you remember how Saul was described then? Where is Saul? The Philistine keeps on talking. His proposal turns to mocking. Verse 10, the Philistine said, This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. Defy might be a bit of a weak term there. What he's doing is he's scoffing, he's mocking, he's treating with them with contempt. And the ranks of the Israelite army. Here is God's people being mocked, treated with disdain by the enemies of God. Where is their king? Where is the one whom God said of in chapter 9, verse 16, when he describes the king, "He will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines"? Where is that guy? Where is the one who will lead God's people out into battle and glorify God by demonstrating that the God of Israel cannot be defeated, for he is the God of heaven and earth? Well, we do hear from Saul now. Verse 11. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. We hear him finally. But what he doesn't stand out as the king, he's with everyone else. Terrified and dismayed. When the stuff hits the fan and you're down for the count, you don't need a leader like everyone else. You need one who is different. See, when you're drowning in the ocean, the last thing you need beside you is another person drowning in the ocean. When you're drowning in the ocean, you need someone in a different situation. You need someone in a boat who can help you in. You want someone different who can rescue you, save you. Israel didn't need just another terrified person. They needed a leader. Someone who would lead them into battle. It's kind of like as the story is told, it's kind of like, oh, there's that. And it's like the scene changes. And we go to Jesse's house. And we kind of just pick up the story of Jesse's house. Meanwhile, back at Jesse's house. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time, he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul. But David, that's in contrast, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. David is introduced in the thing as not someone under Saul. He's going between Saul, the battle, and the home, the farm, and he's kind of in between. He doesn't belong to Saul. He's not under Saul. And then the story continues. For 40 days, the Philistines came forward every morning. This is still going on, and evening, and took his stand. This kind of call out from Goliath. 40 days, morning, evening. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take an ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some of the assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines." Early in the morning, David left with the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. Now, we know what's going on in this battle. David doesn't. He's a young boy about to go where the action is, where his three brothers are, and he's about to kind of, well, you know, you can imagine his anticipation of what he might see. The glory of Israel being shone and as the men go out to fight for their Lord. He was going to the place where he expected these brave men were, fighting for the name of the Lord. And you can imagine the anticipation as he reached the camp, and there he heard the war cry. Oh, I'm in time, the battle's about to start. And you can imagine going out with just, you know, bubbling with energy, waiting to see what would happen. David was just in time for the action. And so David left his things with the keeper of supplies in verse 22 and ran to the battle lines and greeted his brothers. Now, there's a little interesting contrast between Saul and David as well. There's something you might not remember, but you may. Remember when they anointed Saul and they couldn't find him? Do you remember where he was hiding? He was hiding in the baggage, in the keeper of, in the supplies. And so here's the contrast. Saul, the king, like all the other nations, big, tall, handsome, kind of strong-looking Saul, hides in the baggage. Here's young boy David coming out of the baggage to go to the battle line. It's just a little thing that you pick up, the contrast that's been made between David and Saul. Then we read verse 23, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out. And you can imagine this must have been just shattering for David, what takes place now. He stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. And then it goes on, when the Israelites saw the man, they all ran from him in great fear. You could imagine David just standing there bewildered. This is Israel's army. And this was happening for 40 days. Twice a day. It was a pathetic picture. Where was their king at this time? Where was the one who would lead them into battle? What was his plan to deal with the enemies of Israel? We don't know his plan, but we hear rumours of what he'll do. In verse 25, now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. No kidding, Sherlock. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughters in marriage and will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel. Saul is still distant. He's just going, is anyone going to fix this? I'm going to give you a lot of stuff if you fix this. You can imagine David was stunned. And he started asking questions. What will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. David went from one person to the next, totally stunned at what was happening. And then he comes across, his older brother hears what he's doing and what he's saying and the questions he's asking, and his older brother comes to him and kind of rebukes him like a little child. When Eliab, verse 28, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the man, he burned with anger at him and asked, why have you come down here And with whom did you leave these few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. I think Eliab's kind of going, his worldview and how he sees things. He says it's all right to have your ideals in life, as a young man does. To think of God as a great deliverer. It's great to have that idea that God is a great deliverer. It's all right to have your faith. But in the end, life is more complicated than simple faith. Who was David to question what was happening here? This young boy, this inexperienced man with no life experience. Grown men understand what is before their eyes. You just have to look at Goliath and see that life is complicated. Faith is just not so straightforward. In life, you have Goliath-type figures. But David was convicted of the truth that Israel's God could defeat any enemy, and he is dismayed at everyone else's lack of conviction of that truth. David finds himself before Saul. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." It's interesting, Saul takes him a bit seriously here. Maybe this is kind of Saul's desperateness, a young boy before him and going, "Oh, someone's willing to fight him. Oh, good on you." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God, the Lord who rescued me from the jaw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Well, go, and the Lord be with you." Notice where David's confidence comes from. Actually, not in his ability, but it's from the Lord. And there's this funny scene as Saul kind of tries to armour up David with his stuff. Remember, Saul was a big man, David's a young lad. When Saul dressed David in his own tunic, he put a coat of armour on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried to walk around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go on in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 stones from the stream, put them in his pouch of the shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. In the end, there's this big contrast. You see, you're supposed to kind of pick up the contrast. David and the Philistine Goliath. Goliath had the latest state-of-the-art weaponry and defence. He was a big, powerful, threatening man that had lots of wartime experience and trained as a warrior from his youth. David, on the other hand, is a shepherd. He can't fit in any of the armour, so he's just armourless. He doesn't really have a weapon, but he's got some rocks from the river. Put him in his pouch, and off he goes. And this is how it plays out. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome. And he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." these men viewed this situation very differently. And David continues, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. We don't get that in the children's storybooks, the head cutting off bit. This very day I'll give you the carcass of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Again, we hear David's conviction of the truth of who God is. Verse 48, as the Philistines moved closer to attack him, David ran towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath, and after he killed him, and cut off his head with a sword, just as he said he would. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward and with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. So often you hear this story, and the sum up, particularly in some of our children's Bible stories, sum up is, what faith did David have? You should have faith like David as you come against all your Goliaths in life. If you had faith like David, you would defeat all the enemies and win. I shouldn't say in a silly voice, but I think it misses the point. Because this is a story of God's Messiah. How God is moving forward in all history and placing a Messiah to rule and to protect and to fight for his people. And Saul was no good. And David is chosen even as a young boy. And it's not David, but it's the fact that David is God's Messiah that he moves forward. He was his anointed king. And David points through to history to another king that was to come many years after him. A king who would defeat a greater enemy than Goliath. Goliath was great, and this story is great because it's so physical. Goliath was a big man. But if you live for a moment, you know we have greater enemies than big men. We are the enemy from within as we battle with sin. Sin that separates us from God and can destroy us to the point where all we know is death. Sin brings death. We have the battle with a world who does not recognise God's kingdom, does not glorify God in any kind of way. And it's the world we live in and can get sucked into as far as desiring things that the world desires, which leads us to death. And then there's the devil, who wants to destroy and to deceive, who wants us to know death. By ourselves, we cannot approach our enemy. We need someone who will fight for us. Our enemy is too great. We've got nothing before our enemy. Thanks be to God. We have a Messiah that has come in weakness, but in his weakness there is power, and he has given us a victory over our enemy, a victory in a battle we had no hope in, and would remained away from our Father in heaven, trapped in our sin, dead in our sin. More than faith, we need a Messiah who can win our battle. Our New Testament reading is Philippians chapter 2, starting at verse 5. It describes Jesus' mission. Jesus Christ, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but rather he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. He came to fight our battle. And the way he fought it looked quite weak. It looked like no victory at all. But God raised this Messiah. Verse 9, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. We are not being called to a faith like David. We are being called to look to a Messiah like Jesus, one who would fight our battles that we could not win, the one who would give us victory. We're being called to look to him and put our hope in him. For we have a Messiah that has defeated the enemy. We have a King that is worthy of great praise. He has won for us a battle we could not win. The enemy was too fierce, too powerful, and we could not overcome. But he has for us. So we stand in awe of our King and give him praise. I want to finish by encouraging with the words that Paul goes on to say in our New Testament reading. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purposes. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault, in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then you will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labour in vain. For even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. So you should be glad and rejoice with me. Our Messiah is victory. Let us live in the victory against sin, the world, and the devil as we rejoice in him. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for your grace upon us, that we should have a Messiah like Jesus, the Christ, that he would fight our battles for us, and that we might live in the victory of as your children. We do pray, Lord, as we wait for our Saviour's return, that we might live in light of the victory, that we might live as your children with all we have through the victory.